Welcome, brethren, to Section 4 of our presentation on the history of God's preserving His storehouse through the ages. Here we will address the scattering time. Is it a blessing in disguise? It's the period following the death of Brother Houteff from 1955 up to 2010. This is a period marked by a particular murkiness or cloudiness because there's so many rivals and factions, each claiming to be the truth. So our purpose here is to probe down and look for documentation that has been discovered and evidence of who is God led through this time. Who's the true lineage? Of course, we recognize a fulfillment of this scripture in Zechariah 13, verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man that is my fellow, saith the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. So faithful Davidians, after the death of Brother Houteff, recognized the fulfillment of this verse. As the shepherd had been smitten, there would come a time when the sheep would be scattered. And looking back on this in this day, certainly we can say this has been confirmed. This is true, as Davidians are scattered all about the earth in different factions and camps. So let us delve into this period in history to examine closely who's God-led and who are the counterfeits. Well, it was predicted by Brother Houteff in 1951 that unsuspected foes would attempt a knockout blow. And it's this passage here found in White House Recruiter, page 33. Once again, this is published in 1951. I believe Brother Houteff foreknew that the trouble was coming, and God communicated to him for our admonition. And the passage reads, everything that can be done against God's message of today will be done with even greater vengeance than was manifest against heaven's message in the days of Christ's first advent. For the devil knows that if he loses now, he loses forever, that he is to have no other chance. Unparalleled, therefore, is the urgency that every 11th hour church member now quickly and solidly brace himself against the enemy's effort to deliver a knockout blow. We must be alert, too, to realize that the blow is to come from surprisingly unsuspected foes, from professed friends of the gospel, who are no less pious than were the priests in Christ's day. So here we see that we are going to face an era of unprecedented danger, and we need greater vigilance than ever before, because the enemy knows that he's a defeated foe, and he's going to manifest even greater vengeance than in the days of Christ. Can you imagine this? So this attempted knockout blow would come from unsuspecting foes, friends of the gospel. Well, who was the first to arise? None other than this woman, the wife of Brother Houteff, Florence Houteff. Let's look at the record, the evidence to confirm this. Here she is. So we're going to examine the Florence Houteff era from 1955 to 1962, a period of 7 years, basically, by which God gave her and her council time to prove themselves, or to reveal who they really were. So here's a summary breakdown. In February 5th, 1955, the shepherd, Brother Houteff, passed away. The next day, on a Sunday, February 6th, 1955, Florence Houteff usurps the leadership. From 1955 to 58, the Symbolic Code introduces false doctrines and sermons claimed to be from Brother Houteff. November 55, a prediction was made for a 42-month period that would end in the spring of 1955, at which time Ezekiel 9 would take place. In 1957, Old Mount Carmel was sold off, and the proceeds were used to purchase New Mount Carmel near Elk, Texas. In 1959, a solemn assembly was called at New Mount Carmel. April 22nd, 1959, the date of the predicted 42-month prophecy fails. And finally, March 1st, 1962, Florence Houteff and her council resign, and New Mount Carmel is given into the receivership of a Texas lawyer. So this is a summary of the shocking and sad history of this council under Florence Houteff's guidance. So let's look at some of the details here. Well, Brother Houteff passed away on the Sabbath evening, February 5th. The next day, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Florence Houteff convened a council meeting. And this was her request to the council. This is a copy of the original document. She says, I'm requesting by this letter that the council convene for the purpose of considering and passing a resolution that the following request made by V.T. Houteff before his death. So she's claiming that Brother Houteff made these before his death. Now, nobody has a record of it, but this is what was claimed, that in case of V.T. Houteff's death, which would automatically leave vacant the office of president, Mrs. Florence Houteff be appointed to fill the office of vice president. So right here we see that the office of president was destroyed by Florence Houteff, and she appointed herself to become vice president. This is a very startling announcement. Now bear in mind that this was the day after her husband died. Is this reasonable that a wife whose husband just passed would be planning such a thing? Shouldn't someone be grieving over the loss of her husband and preparing for or thinking of perhaps the funeral services? But no, this hatches as a well-calculated plot, a takeover, because she realized that there were other elements looking for a takeover. So later that day, 2 more meetings were held. The whole day was consumed with a takeover of the association. So this was a meeting held at 1:30, and the council members decided to pass the first 2 recommendations, that she become vice president and that her brother be appointed member of the executive council to replace her as secretary. But the last 2 requests were debated considerably. But finally, later that evening at 8 o'clock, they agreed to approve it, that she be given permanent welfare and support as long as she lives by the council, by the association. So she basically not only put herself in as a head of the association, but that she would be perpetually supported by them. Rather remarkable power play here, and it's all documented. Later that year, in May 7th, 1955, some Davidians started to wake up and ask some hard questions about how this all took about, because Davidians were obviously shocked and grieved at Brother Houteff's death and didn't have time to consider all of these particulars. But as the time passed, Brother Wolf, who was a council member, asked this question. This is recorded. How can you prove that the president appointed you to be vice president? Answer. I cannot prove it. I have nothing in writing. But since Brother Houteff did not appoint anyone else, you're going to have to believe me when I tell you that he appointed me. Now, I would like to ask you a question. How can you prove that you're a member of the executive council? My, very shrewd and calculating woman, and would not challenge or take anybody to challenge her usurping of the council and the association. We're going to find out soon that later she lied. This came out years later in a testimony in a court trial in 1965, when after the New Mount Carmel had been liquidated, there was a court trial involving Davidians who were trying to reclaim the remaining assets. And Ben Roden of the Branch fame was trying to seize the remaining 77 acres of property. So this came out during one of these court trials, and here's the testimony. Some humor was injected into the scene when part of the testimony was termed, quote, hearsay. When Mrs. Aiken, Sister Houteff, of course, she remarried a man named Aiken after Victor Houteff died. When Mrs. Aiken testified that Brother Houteff appointed her vice president, and that part of her testimony was ruled out under the dead man statute, after which she admitted that she was elected vice president by the remaining members of the council. She basically fooled them. There was no evidence or record that Brother Houteff appointed her to take over. This is, of course, charged by the conference, but there is no evidence. It is inadmissible in a court of law. It is also stated that Mrs. Aiken testified that E.T. Wilson had resigned as vice president of the association before Brother Houteff's death, thus leaving a vacancy for the council to fill. Who knows the real facts? Of course, this once again is hearsay, claiming that the lawful replacement for Brother Houteff as president after he died should have been Brother E.T. Wilson. But he at the time was in Yoder, Wyoming, recovering from an illness, and she moved quickly before he could rightfully come in and take over as the head of the association. So we see here a very clever power play on her part. Her work is rather disturbing, but it's a very important lesson for us to see how she not only took over but corrupted the work, starting with the symbolic code. Here's two symbolic codes, volume 11, number 1 and number 5. Now, people that believe in these codes published after her death, sometimes referred to as the new codes, should answer the question, why don't you publish these codes? Well, the answer is obvious. Here's a statement from volume 11, number 1, published in November 55. 1. That the fulfillment of the slaughter of Ezekiel 9 is immediately preceded by the 42-month, Revelation 11:2, or 1260 days, Revelation 11:3. As we approach the time of these events, more can be said about them. But for now, the important point to be emphasized is that it is clear that we have already entered into the period of the 42 months. She fell into a trap and made a time-setting prophecy by this publishing this statement. And of course, this was confirmed later in the volume 11, number 5 issue, published March 1956, where it says, moreover, since the promised Elijah is to be the last prophet to the church today, General Conference Special, page 23 and 24, and since he has come and gone, we can know that we are now in the 42 months, the 1260 days of Revelation 11, when the two witnesses are to prophesy. So she put herself in a time trap. False prophecy. In addition, these new codes that she published, volumes 11 through 14, came with certain sermon addresses claimed to be from Brother Houteff, of dubious origin. Here's a collection of these codes that are found in the James White Library of Andrews University. So the Adventists have these things, and they think this is all the work of Brother Houteff, and that he authorized his wife to do this. Of course, it couldn't be farther from the truth. It starts over here on the upper left with volume 10, number 1. Of course, we learned that is one of the codes that Brother Houteff published, September 54, and also volume 10, number 2. But that's it. After that, everything else was the work of Florence Houteff, and in it contains a mixture of truth and error. So they have these all bundled up together, thinking that this is the work of Victor Houteff, when it is not. And this is her claim to authority. She wrote this in Symbolic Code, Volume 11, Number 2, page 3. From time to time, as the Lord directs, it will be the privilege of the Symbolic Code to publish certain sermons delivered by the late Brother Houteff, V.T. Houteff, through the years before the timely greetings was started. These sermons will be judiciously selected on the basis of their current application to our present needs, from the most complete collection of existing notes on his sermon addresses since 1929. Well, the question is, where are these this complete collection of existing notes. To date, all that's ever appeared is a page or two for a couple of these codes. The association that's at Waco today claims to have covered that they had stolen out of a trailer after the Waco burnout, the Branch Davidian burnout. But nothing definitive, no clear records. So this really casts a shadow of a doubt about the whole authorization of these. They weren't authorized by the prophet. They were done by the wife. Well, Brother Houteff, before his death, ordered that Mount Carmel be sold off. This was a very important development that was published in Symbolic Code, Volume 10, Number 1, pages 3 and 6, and this is September 54. This was published by Brother Houteff. It reads, "Now again, with even greater emphasis towards reaching your goal, Mount Carmel Center makes the following announcement to all faithful Davidians who will realize that this good news is perhaps nothing short of a sign. Mount Carmel Center, by commencing to first sell off its excess property, then the whole, is symbolically leading the way to the program that is outlined by the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy. Be it therefore known that part of Mount Carmel property is being subdivided for high-class residences, beginning with the old peach orchard near Mount Carmel interest." And of course, this program that he was referring to is called the hunting campaign. They had been sending out literature for years by the millions to fish out Seventh-day Adventists. So now, according to Jeremiah 16, verse 16, was to begin a hunting campaign. So he bought a fleet of cars with the money from this sell-off and equipped ministers to go out house to house to hunt out Seventh-day Adventists who had been receiving this literature and to give them Bible studies and to find out where they stood with the message. So this is what he was referring to, and this is how it was financed. And notice he said to first sell off the excess, then the whole. And this is the code. This is an authentic code, and they're scanned copies of this for anybody that wants to see any of the content in this presentation. We have digital copies of all of it. So by 1957, Old Mount Carmel was completely sold off. And this was announced in Symbolic Code Volume 11, Number 8, June 56. Now, of course, this was published by Florence Houteff, but this was nothing of prophetic importance. This was just reporting facts of what happened at the camp there. So initially, 35 acres were subdivided and sold, but then increasing competition and new regulations and requirements of the city as property was taken into the expanding city limits necessitated the selling off of lots to land developers. And we saw in the last presentation that the city limits had, by 56, it engulfed the original property. And with that were all these, like I say, regulations and requirements. And so that precipitated the quick sell-off of the remaining portion in large tracts. With that proceeds, 941 acres were purchased near Elk, Texas, about approximately 20 miles northeast of Old Mount Carmel, which became known as New Mount Carmel Center. Several residential homes, an administrative building, and a large tabernacle for meetings was built from the revenues generated by the sell-off of the lots and homes at Old Mount Carmel. So New Mount Carmel Center, here was the office building, and here was the tabernacle, and here's some pictures from the air showing a series of row houses built by Florence Houteff and her council to house the workers. There were 13 of those houses built, you can see here. And you notice here that there's a foundation on this photo on the left, and then on the photo on the right, a structure's being built up. This photo was taken in the early 1980s, about 83 or 84, and this was the beginning of the branch compound under David Koresh. Remember, this property was taken over by Ben Roden in the mid-1960s. And David Koresh, when he got control of it, started to build this large compound that later became the place that was burned down. And so all these 13 houses were taken apart and used to build that structure. And notice, interesting also, these photos were taken by the U.S. Treasury Department. So the government was already watching this place a decade before the burnout. So the beginnings of the branch compound under Koresh. Well, the hunting campaign that was started by Brother Houteff in 1953 takes a whole new direction under Florence Houteff. And this is told here in this publication. It says, the plagues came during this time in the form of various campaigns. Now, Florence Houteff wrote and published that 7 plagues came to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, this is rather remarkable that she made this, but here's what she identified the plagues were. To name them specifically, they were 1, the distribution of a vast amount of raw literature to Seventh-day Adventists; 2, the door-to-door contacting of Adventists by Davidians; 3, the passing out of raw literature at the Adventist churches; 4, the displaying of hear ye the rod signs before Adventist churches; 5, the displaying of signs and passing out of rod literature at all the Adventist camp meetings; 6, the effort of Davidians in Cleveland, including the publishing of an open letter to the General Conference session; and 7, the present radio program, the 11th Hour Call, which is now being expanded to nationwide coverage. So this is all the work of Florence Houteff. Of course, the rod in the old codes tells us not to go onto the property, church property, Seventh-day Adventist Church, and hand out the literature where it's not legal. So there's several contradictions here with what we're instructed in the original rod message. Furthermore, this campaign, if you will, to put signs on the vehicles created quite an uproar. We see here in the top this car with the placard on the top in front of the First Seventh-day Adventist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. And, of course, they put bullhorns on this and would bark out portions of the message, and of course it elicited opposition. The police showed up, like here we see a cruiser, and created a lot of hostility. And here's a car down here at a camp meeting. And I've talked to a Davidian that was part of this, and he said it made him very ashamed to be part of this rude and disruptive behavior, and not going about gathering names the way that Brother Houteff instructed us, to make friends with Adventists, not to make enemies with them. This campaign in 1958 to the General Conference session, here's this open letter that they published in the Cleveland newspaper. At the time they were holding a session there in Cleveland, Ohio. They furthermore had meetings advertised in a hotel next to where the attendees were staying. And then they put advertisements on the city buses. So they created quite a stir amongst all the public with this message that I'm sure most of the public wondered what was going on here. They don't understand these things, the judgment of the living and so forth. So these are some of the things that Florence and her council authorized. But perhaps the most dramatic apostasy from the message is her decision to take the message to the Protestant churches. In order to do this, they bought a radio station. And here's Dudley Goff, who was one of the students under Brother Houteff, ministerial students. He's speaking for the 11th Hour Call on nationwide radio program, ABC and so forth. And here's their recording room and equipment. And Florence was proud of this. They published it. And they took the original rod literature, completely rewrote it. And every time the word church or Seventh-day Adventist church was mentioned, they rewrote it and said, well, that's the Protestant churches now. We're done with Laodicea. And you think, wow. They completely remodeled the rod and took the message to the Protestants way premature to the giving a loud cry. So I think this is one of the reasons that God had to move the storehouse, that it can no longer be with Florence Houteff. So the question is, how did this come about? We're going to look into this. One more dramatic apostasy was that Florence and her council placed the rod message on the altar, completely unauthorized. So they sent this open letter out to the General Conference Committee of Seventh-day Adventists in February 17, 1959. And in this remarkable statement, it reads, this means that the shepherd's rod message is now on the altar. If you are positive that your position that the shepherd's rod is not of the Lord and that you're being led of God to resist it, you will not hesitate to put your all on the altar as well. If the message and work of the shepherd's rod is God's truth, as we believe it is, the 1260 days of Revelation 11, as the symbolic codes have explained, will end sometime this spring of course, 1959. So here it is. She took the entire rod message, written and published by Brother Houteff, and put it on the altar on the basis of a false time-setting prophecy of her own origin. Remarkable thing. Nobody has the authority to put God's message on the altar and challenge the unbelievers. Sad, sad development. Rank apostasy. Well, this series of colossal blunders never brought repentance, but it finally did come to an end. I believe God appointed her 7 years, and that was it. So finally, in March 1st, 1962, here's a copy, she and her council resigned. They took a large portion of first tithe, apparently $10,000, $20,000 apiece, disappeared, left the remaining assets, some of the second tithe and the land, in the hands of a Texas lawyer, and they signed it off and disappeared. So, did that mean the rod was dead? The church capitalized on this blunder and pronounced in the signs of the times that the rod was dead because of this. But was it? Let us dig deeper under the surface and find out what happened, how God preserved His truth through this dark hour of apostasy. So the question is, who are the true lineage of the shepherd's rod today? How did God preserve the truth after Florence and her council attempted to deliver the knockout blow? Well, this part of the history is not commonly told, but the records are there. The documentation has been uncovered, and the truth is going to be told, so that you all know that come into the rod in these recent times, for those of us that did not live through this period, can know the truth and see how God has led His people in the past. It's a remarkable story, so join me as we enter in. Of course, Brother Houteff warned us that usurpers would emerge. For example, in this statement in Timely Greetings, Volume 1, Number 5, page 14, it reads, "Man has long been exalting himself, so much so, in fact, that there are perhaps only a few Christians in the world that are really following the light of the Lord. Many of them are following sparks of men, following uninspired interpretations of Scriptures, devisings of men who scoff at the idea of inspiration. They see no more need of truth or of prophets, although they well know that the only truth that has ever come has been through chosen servants of God. Even present truth believers have not as yet fully awakened to this startling revelation. Many of them are carried away with every wind of doctrine, much of which is created by impostors, such as Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Numbers 16, verses 9 to 11. "Coveting Moses' office, usurpers of inspiration's throne, taking sides, one for Paul and another for Apollos, as it were." So here we're plainly told exactly what has taken place in our midst. The rise of impostors and usurpers. They're literally everywhere as we look at the situation we face in Davidia today. But thank God that we were forewarned of these things. So with no shepherd, many factions appear. Let's break this down to at least 10 major factions that have arisen since 1955. The first, in chronological order, the Branch Davidians under Ben Roden, Bashan Hill under M.J. Bingham, the General Association SDA at Salem, Acclaim of Mount Carmel Center, this is under Don Adair, the International GAD SDA, Red Bluff, California, this is under Wanda Bloom, O'Berry, the GAD SDA Mountaindale, Mount Carmel Center, acclaimed to be Mount Carmel Center, GAD SDA Waco, also claiming to be Mount Carmel Center. The Gileadites under M.T. Jordan, that broke off at Bashan Hill. The Heralds of the King, a breakaway from Mountaindale. The Mustard Seed Advent, a breakaway from Bashan. And GSDA Tennessee. So we have at least 10 factions here. The question is, who's the true? Who are the counterfeits? So let us dig in to find out. How does the true lineage uphold the truth? who publishes the original rod literature? This is the key. Along the pathway, we have to identify who kept the rod alive. The original rod, not the counterfeit or the remodeled stuff, but the original. So this is the golden thread, if you will, to trace the history. So let us begin. In Southern California, there was a call for reorganization. And from 1961 to 1970, God had a storehouse here. So in 1960, brothers H.G. Warden, remember, he was one of the first ministers under Brother Houteff, and then M.J. Bingham was editor. They opposed Florence Houteff's counsel and called for reorganization. This is all documented. They begin to question her claims of the 42-month and taking the message to the Protestants. They weren't the only ones, but they let out. In September 61, a session was held in Arlington, California to reorganize, quote, 100% rod-only believers to begin to republish the original rod tract literature. In 63, M.J. Bingham splits off and sets up a rival association that later becomes known as Bashan Hill. And then finally in 69, session delegates decide to relocate eastward to Salem, South Carolina on the basis of Ezekiel 47. So how did this process begin to restore the message in the midst of this apostasy? Well, it began by restoring the symbolic code. And so 2 successive codes were published to call for a special session to reorganize the work. And this is in harmony with the Leviticus, that a session can be only called and announced in successive issues of symbolic code. So the code was rescued from the usurpers and republished or reorganized. And the session code was published after the session was carried out, and it introduced a new executive council and bylaws, closer in harmony to the original rod. And a temporary headquarters was located in Arlington, California. So here's the 61 session. Here's a couple pictures of the people involved. And this involved as they called themselves, the 100% rod-only believers. And they reorganized here in California to oppose the apostate Florence Houteff-led association. In these pictures, there's some key figures that we would like to point out that will become important later. On the picture on the left, over on the left-hand side, that tall man, that's M.J. Bingham. Off to the center, back behind about the third row, is Brother Harry Warden. And then down in front of him in the front row is a young man. This is Donnie Wayne Adair. And all of these people will have roles later as we see the history unfolding. One of the first things they did is republish 3 letters that opposed Florence Houteff's apostate council. And it was in a little tract calling 144,000 Nathaniels. And this, of course, is in the Andrews University Library. We have copies of this if anybody wants to see it. They published these 3 letters. In April 9th, 1959, a protest letter was written by true Davidians to the General Conference Executive Committee against this February 17th letter from Florence Houteff and her council, which put the rod message on the altar. They were protesting this before the April 22 false prediction came to pass. There was a letter published in February 5th, 1961, a statement by 100% rod-only Davidians to the General Conference Committee that the rod message was indeed alive and well, and that the work of Florence was not in harmony with the rod. And then finally they published a letter September 5th, 1961 to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the newspaper who had been reporting on these events, and reported Florence Houteff's side of the story, where she's basically blaming her husband for the blunders. And of course they set the record straight and published it for all the public to see. So these are remarkable letters, and we encourage you to read them. So in Southern California, God had a faithful few that preserved the message. And here's some pictures of them. This is a group here on the upper right. It's in Riverside, California. And you'll notice here Brother Warden and his wife, in front of the charts. Here's another group from California. Brother Warden's out there in front. And here's another group. I believe this one's in Vista, California. Brother Warden's here. So he's really the man that kept things together. He wrote many of these letters to the conference protesting against Florence and also the rise of the branch. So he was really the one that God was using to hold the original rod together. So who was the faithful minister who stood strong against all this apostasy? Well, it was this man, Brother Warden. He was the hero. This is him and his wife in the early 1970s. He continued to travel and publish for the rod all the way up until his death, into his 90s. So he was quite a warrior for the truth. So he steadfastly held the leadership during the very tumultuous 1961 to 69 era. He was the council head, the vice president. He defended the integrity of the original rod message to the General Conference leadership, and he also opposed the breakaway of M.J. Bingham and his Jacob typology doctrine starting in 63, and this is written and recorded. And he met the opposition coming from Ben Roden and the rise of the branch heresy. So literally, it was one man and his wife and a few others that kept the rod alive. Later, the publishing work moves to Salem, South Carolina in the era from 1970 to 74. So here are the highlights. The first session was held in 1970 at the Salem Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's the very one we talked about before that took a stand in Brother Houteff's day. 1971, the Executive Council decides to incorporate with the state of South Carolina for IRS 501c3 application. We're going to see this has a significant implication here later. 1972, Don Adair was elected vice president. By 1973, controversial doctrines began to appear in the Symbolic Code, and these were written and published by Don Adair. And this resulted in 1974, a group of 14 signatories separate because of this error in Don Adair's activities to reorganize the association back in Southern California, in YUCAIPA. So let's look at this. Salem here is there with on this Google map. It's in the western tip of South Carolina, on the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Very, very beautiful place. So that's where the storehouse was, west of Greenville, South Carolina. So the Southern California Association moves and it moves to Salem. So here's a picture of that session in 1970. The important figures here, there's Brother Warden's in this picture. Brother Sump Smith, he was the oldest son of the Smith family, and he was voted the leader. Sidney Smith is in the background. Don Adair's out there in front. So all these people have roles to play as history unfolds. So this was the session held at that church, the only Davidian church that still stands. And of course, it was published in two successive codes, the pre-session edition and the session edition, announcing the move from Vista, California to Salem, South Carolina. So this was all legal according to the Leviticus. And here is some of the pictures of the Salem Association. It was operated, the print house, out of an addition to that rest home that was built in 1946. So here's a picture of it, and they had a sign out in front identifying it. Here's a picture of that church. This is actually a contemporary picture of that Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Church in Salem. Here's a picture of the inside of the print shop with their duplicator and the equipment and all the literature that they published there, the original, and a picture of the office. And here's copies of the literature. Salem continued to print rod track literature as facsimile reproductions of the original. Facsimile means literally a photographic reproduction. Same size, same layout. And they preserved the original cover artwork for the timely greetings. So here's some samples. You notice the leaf and the typesetting and the layout for those timely greetings was essentially the same as Brother Houteff. Same with the tracks. They're identical. However, Salem decided September 2nd, 1971 to incorporate with the state of South Carolina. The Executive Council did this. And there's a part of this incorporation document with the state that's rather telling. It reads, in the event of dissolution, the residual assets of the organization will be turned over to one or more religious organizations which themselves are exempt organizations described in Section 501c3 and 170c of the Internal Revenue Code of 1954, or corresponding provisions or any other prior or future revenue code. And here's a copy of that document with the council members that signed off on it. Why they did this, it's not clear, but this is a serious breach, because by incorporating with the state, you're basically forming a confederacy with the government, and your religion is now defined by the definition of the IRS and not the Bible. You have substituted the lordship of Jesus Christ and taken Caesar as your head, and there are very serious repercussions for this, and we have a whole study separately on this as you want to look into it, because all the associations have followed this trend, unfortunately. So the Salem Association moves to YUCAIPA in 1974 and is there until 1986. So here's some highlights of that. In January 74, 14 brethren send a letter to the Salem Executive Council calling for retraction of private interpretations, theories, and ideas in a quote published in the Symbolic Codes. And these were, of course, studies that were authored by Don Adair. In 74, the Brethren in California reorganized under the 1961 session bylaws. And a republication, the original raw track literature resumes. In 75, the cover artwork changes. New charts were added and new study tracks were created. We'll see more about how this came about in our section 5 of our presentation about remodeling the rod. You'll see more how this came about. And then in 83, Wanda Bloom, Howard Bloom, along with Erwin Reichman, and they broke off and formed the International GADSDA of Cal Mesa, California. And this arose because of a dispute of her wanting to control the work there in YUCAIPA and remodel the rod, much like Florence Houteff did. And so people protested that, and she broke away, started her own thing. And then in 86, YUCAIPA group was discovered by Mountaindale, and they decided to merge and move eastward and bring the printing work out there eastward to Mountaindale. So YUCAIPA here was in the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains, outside of San Bernardino. You can see Loma Linda here, Riverside, California, and this is in the Los Angeles basin. Actually very close to where the message arose in 1930. So let's look at this protest letter to the Salem Council. This was written and published in January 8th, 1974, and signed off by 14 Davidians, including Brother Warden. In this petition signed by these 14 concerned brethren was a protest to the Salem Council for publishing new unauthorized doctrines in the Symbolic Codes, numbers 12, volume 12, numbers 2 and 3. So here we see this pattern repeating, that somebody hijacks the codes and begins to introduce heretical teachings. So a split arose, and Salem refused to give them a hearing. And so a follow-up letter, rather than meet with these concerned brethren, Don Adair chose to broadcast in the next code to the field that these people, it was a response in Symbolic Code Volume 16, number 1 of 1974, and he broadcast it to the whole world field and did not give these people a hearing. So because of that, Salem refused to retract. They wrote that since Salem has refused to retract her private interpretations in her last 4 codes, we have been forced to reorganize with headquarters at 304 Palm Drive, Vista, California. And this was basically a private home of Brother Warden. And here's a copy of this letter. Anybody can get a copy and read it, download it and read it. Important document. So Salem becomes YUCAIPA Association in 1974. So YUCAIPA started at the home of Brother Warden in Palm Drive, Vista, California, and then moved to YUCAIPA in 75 and then remained there until 86. But they were all under the same charter. They represented a continuation of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association, started in 1961 and incorporated with the state of California in 1963. And their mailing address was the Universal Publishers Association, P.O. Box 635, YUCAIPA, California. And that's what appears on the literature. And this was the council that was appointed in 1975. The leaders are Sidney Smith was the vice president. He's on the left. And then next to him, Howard Bloom. Behind him is his wife, Wanda Bloom. Then the black lady was Fern Fry, and then Erwin Reichman, and then the two older ladies in front. One of them's Lula Mae Newson. I don't know which is which, but this was the council that was appointed in 75 at YUCAIPA. Now, YUCAIPA continued to publish original raw literature, facsimile reproductions, and here's some photographs of that literature, and there are copies of this still available. And these were printed in original format and typesetting. No alterations. However, the cover of the Timely Greetings, as I pointed out before, changed, and here it is. The font changed to this wedding type of font, and the whole look and feel was quite different. And this was the work of Wanda Bloom. So a dramatic alteration from the original. So we see this continual tendency to want to change the original, to steady the arc, if you will, on the original literature. So that first arose here in YUCAIPA. Now later, YUCAIPA merges with Mountaindale, and Mountaindale had its origins in 1983 and continued to about 2005. 1982, there are about 50 members of the Salem Association were cast out, primarily from the Caribbean islands. These were brethren that had been won into the message and were members of Salem, and this included Norman Archer, Anthony Hibbert, Peter Nosworthy, and others. In 83, they were cast out by Adair. That's a whole nother story, but they didn't know what to do. They started up there in Mountaindale in 83. Some other brethren came in and purchased the camp for Mountaindale. Some brethren that came into the message. And then 86, a couple years before, they found out, these brethren at Mountaindale find out about these older Davidians out in YUCAIPA, and they met with them, and one thing led to another. The groups merged. They had a joint session, and they joined together, and as a result, the printing press that was in YUCAIPA moved eastward to Mountaindale. And then in 87, the old codes were discovered. They actually were in the possession of Sister Bonnie Smith, and when these came out, it created a lot of excitement and also some trouble, as we'll learn. As a result of that, certain statements from those codes were used by a large rebellious fraction that split off and moved back to Waco, Texas, to a small portion of Old Mount Carmel. And this is primarily the work of Norman Archer. And 1998, Mountaindale, the tract literature begins to be reformatted, and the cover art changes because they were no longer, the printing plates were wearing out, so they went to digital. And finally, in 2005, a special session was held. There was a lot of turmoil in the camp, and it resulted in a split, with the majority of the white and the Spanish members being separated and being scattered about. So Mountaindale, New York, here is in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, out in a rural location. Here's some pictures of this place. It's in an area where there's a lot of Jewish camps. So this was an old Jewish camp that was purchased. This is going up into there. This is their dormitory and their meeting house or their chapel, their kitchen area, and some apartments on the top, and cafeteria. This is a print shop they built, I believe, in 94, 95. These pictures were taken at the time, that special session 2005, in which that camp split. And here's a meeting during that time. Now, Mountaindale, starting in 86, started to republish the rod, and they did it facsimile reproduction from 1988 to about around 89, and then they began to digitally retypeset it, and things began to change. The Timely Greetings were reprinted. The text was original, but the cover art were continuing to follow the YUCAIPA example. Perhaps they didn't know about the originals, but this is how the truth was preserved at Mountaindale. Well, where does that bring us till today? Well, we'll see in the next part where the literature, even at Mount Dale, has changed. It's no longer original. Well, one of the things that was recognized is that this idea that during this time there was essentially only one publishing house to supply the whole world. And the Adventist membership of the Adventist Church now is in excess of 16 million, as we pointed out in the previous presentation. So how are we going to reach all these people if there's only one publishing house in the United States that isn't probably even printing out 50,000 pieces a year, much less every 2 weeks, as in the height of Brother Houteff's day? It's only logical that there would be more than one publishing house, and it's right in the message. And here's the statement. In Volume 7, Testimonies, page 140. Actually, the section is called Our Publishing Work. It starts on page 138 and goes to 150. Read the whole thing. You'll see here is a command that's really talking directly to us, how the work will be done at the end, the latter days. It reads here, and in a large degree through our publishing houses, plural, is to be accomplished the work of that other angel who comes down from heaven with great power and who lightens the earth with his glory. So the question, who's that other angel? Well, we know it's no other than the fourth angel of Revelation 18. It's the message of the shepherd's rod, the judgment of the living. So it's going to be carried out through publishing houses. And it only makes sense that there would be publishing houses where Adventists are located all around the world, especially in places like Indonesia and Africa and the Philippines. There's many more Adventists over there than in North America. So we recognize this back as early as 2004. It reads also here, our publishing houses are God's appointed centers, and through them is to be accomplished a work the magnitude of which is yet unrealized. There are lines of effort and influence as yet by them almost untouched, which God is calling for their cooperation. As the messages of truth advances into new fields, it is God's purpose that the work of establishing new centers shall be constantly going forward. Page 144. Is this happening today? There's something missing here. What has happened is people are trying to rule the world through a council of 7 people in the United States, and it just can't be. This is the same problem that happened in Battle Creek, that the leading men were trying to control the work out of Battle Creek and inhibit the work to go around the world. And Ellen White warned against it. And there were serious repercussions for this. So think about it. Apply the history lesson for us today. So as a result of those councils and others, and this great necessity for the publishing work to get all over the world, we ourselves have been in the Philippines, and the poor people there are starved. They get very little or no literature. What shows up there is shipped at great expense, thousands of dollars. It goes to Manila. The brethren there take what they want, and by the time it gets down to Mindanao, the South Island, they hardly have anything, and much of it not even original. So the people are starved. It makes much more sense to publish it locally. And we've talked about this to people, and they somehow don't believe it, or they want permission from the council. Ought we to obey God or man? Well, at any rate, UPA7.org was born out of necessity. In 2006 to 2010, December 26, 2006, labor was began to restore the Rod literature to its original estate. Everything had changed so much. So let's get back to the foundation, the original. 2007, the first of 3 trips to gather all of the original Rod artwork was located in various institutions to scan it and do digital reproductions, like a facsimile. Fortunately, this has been preserved in several places. 2008, UPA7.org website was launched on August 17th. This created quite a stir in Davidia. It was an unprecedented development, announcing the ability, or offering the ability to anybody, to print the Rod literature in their own home. 2009, complete set of the original Symbolic codes, Volume 1 to Volume 10, Number 2, were released as downloadable PDFs. Anybody can print them out. And free from the unauthorized new codes. 2010, the original 1944 Rod study charts were digitally restored and made available. And in 2010, a preparation for the General Conference session in Atlanta had begun. Well, of course, that's past now. let's look at some of this development here. Of course, here's the website. It's a very plain and simple thing. But in here was the invitation for brethren to break free from controlling powers. And if they had a desire in their heart to get the literature, is that they can download the print copies and make their own, even from their own bedroom, their own home. So here's a picture we made of all of that original literature in its original size and formats. The 15 tracts, Timely Greetings, Volume 1, Volume 2, the miscellaneous tracts, and the answer books. All there, done simply out of a bedroom. So all 75 pieces, the original raw literature, available for printing using simple low-cost equipment, computer, laser printer, and simple cutting tools. The rod pocket-sized tracts could be printed from multiple locations around the world. Even single-family homes can make their own literature for sharing. The old codes were restored in the exact layout and format. They weren't reformatted. So the letter size for Volume 1, Number 1, to Volume 2's Numbers 1 and 2. And then, of course, the magazine-style layout for Volume 2, Numbers 3 and 4, up to Volume 7, Numbers 1 to 6. And then Volume 7, Numbers 6 to 12, and Volume 9, Numbers 1 to 12 had their own unique covers. So all of these have been restored and preserved and available for printing. The original rod study charts were digitally restored, and we'll learn more about this in the next presentation. But here's the pristine original artwork that was done under the direction of Brother Houteff. It's truly spectacular, the detail and information as you closely examine these. As well as this research was done, a great amount of historical documentation was uncovered, much of which we've shown you in this presentation. And of course, the value of this can't be underestimated, and it was scanned and preserved. For example, this original bequeathment certificate that's mentioned in the answer books. So many of these documents that involved the work of old Mount Carmel were preserved. PDF copies of original source material that were cited in the rod are available for people. A photo gallery of the original rod study charts are available on websites. PDF scans of all the original rod track literature in its latest edition, so people can actually see what the original looked like, unaltered. And earlier editions of some tracks, and draft copies of Timely Greetings Volume 1, anything related to the history and advance of the message that could be gained was preserved. And this will continue to be released as time goes on. Of course, it started in Hartford, Connecticut. You think, why Hartford? Actually, just south of Hartford is Rocky Hill, Connecticut. And that's where the Adventist publishing work started. So perhaps it's a coincidence. But this is where it started. Since this presentation was put together, this UPA7.org has moved out into the country, following the counsel of Ellen White, to get out of the city. So we thank God for that. So what are the identifying marks of the true publishing house during this era? Well, one, it's not who they are or what they say, it's what they do. They publish the original copies of Shepherd's Rod Message. 2, they distribute tract literatures as the leaves of autumn to the brethren in Laodicea without cost or obligation, according to divine mandate. They have arisen out of necessity when existing storehouse falls into apostasy. They tend to move in an overall eastward direction according to the prophecy of Ezekiel River. And they institute a proper system of second tithing to fulfill the commission given in Isaiah 58. There are other criteria. Let's look at this movement graphically here. The succession of storehouses after Brother Houteff, or since Brother Houteff's day. Well, it started in Glendale, California, number 1. And in 1930. In 1935, it moved to Waco, Texas. It remained there until 1961, where it reorganized back in Southern California, Vista. From Vista, it was there from 61 to 69, and then it moved out in 1970 out to Salem, South Carolina. A branch of the original work under Brother Houteff's time. And he said to them that this would be important in the future of God's work. And sure enough, it came to pass. After Salem, it reorganized back in YUCAIPA, Southern California once again. And then YUCAIPA later, in 1986, merged with Mountaindale back in the east. This brings us up to 2005. As we said, Mountaindale split in 2005. And out of that, a variety of splinters. And in 2006, the work to restore the rod back to its estate began at UPA7.org. So, what is the lineage of the true and faithful? Well, it began in Los Angeles, California, the center of the work. 1930 to 34, it moved eastward on the base of the Ezekiel River to Waco, Texas from 1935 to 1962. In 61, it had reorganized back in Southern California in Vista up until 1970. The fourth succession is it moved to Salem, South Carolina from 1970 to 74, then back to California, YUCAIPA from 74 to 86, and then from 83 to 2005, Mountaindale, New York. So where's the true publishing house today? Well, the evidence is before you. Seek and you shall find, and truly God will make it known. We thank you for your attention. We would once again like to acknowledge, first and foremost, our kind Heavenly Father above for his enduring mercies, all-sufficient grace, and abundant mercy for the providential circumstances upon which this ministry was started. And we're also grateful to God for those open-hearted saints who have made sacrifices to support this work. And we can be reached at upah7.org, 860-798-3672, email upa5453@gmail.com. Thank you for your time once again and your attention. May God richly bless you as you search for truth as for hidden treasure. And come join us on part 5 of our presentation entitled The Remodeling of the Rod. Thank you, and once again, God bless.